If you told me that Tuesday would end with me holding a photograph of a 2-year-old boy with my husband's exact same eyes, the same eyes I'd been told for 10 years I wasn't allowed to give a child of my own, I wouldn't have believed a single word. I didn't know that in 20 minutes my entire life was going to come apart and that somehow, by the same evening, I would already be putting myself back together. My name is Helen Carter. I'm 44 years old, and for 16 years, I have been David Carter's wife, his bookkeeper, his silent partner, and the woman he liked to remind, quietly, only when no one else could hear, that without him, I was nothing. That morning started like any other. I was in the waiting room of Dr. Renner's dental office on Ashford Street, scrolling through old photos on my phone while I waited for my cleaning appointment, killing 10 minutes the way you do in places designed to make you sit still and think about nothing. A woman sat down beside me, maybe late 30s, tired eyes, a toddler's diaper bag over one shoulder, even though no toddler was with her. She glanced at my phone screen, at a photo of David from our anniversary dinner 2 years back. His arm around me, his practiced smile aimed at the camera the way it was always aimed at everyone but me. She went pale. Not embarrassed pale, frightened pale. "Wait," she said, low enough that the receptionist behind the glass didn't look up. "Is that... you're not... you don't know, do you?" I felt something cold settle low in my stomach. The kind of cold that arrives before your mind has caught up to why. "Know what?" I asked. She looked at the door like she was measuring the distance to it. "Never mind," she said. "I'm sorry. I thought you were someone else." And she stood up and walked out of that waiting room so fast her diaper bag knocked over a stack of magazines, and she didn't look back once. I sat there with my heart doing something strange and irregular in my chest, telling myself it was nothing, telling myself strangers say strange things, telling myself the same lies I had been telling myself for years without ever noticing I was doing it. I need you to understand something about me before I go any further. I am not a woman who goes looking for trouble. I grew up in a house where my mother kept the peace by keeping quiet, and I learned that lesson so well, I built an entire marriage on top of it. 16 years with David Carter, co-owner of Carter and Boyd Construction, a man who could charm a room of investors in under 5 minutes, and then, in the car afterward, tell me my dress had looked cheap in the light. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. "Without me, Helen, you're nothing," he told me once quietly, the week I mentioned wanting to go back to finish my accounting certification. "Who exactly is going to pay for this house if I'm not around to remind you how lucky you are?" I didn't argue. I never did. I filed it away the way I filed away every other small cruelty, telling myself that was just what marriage looked like after enough years, that the ache in my chest was simply the weight of commitment settling in. I didn't sleep well that night after the dental office. I kept turning the woman's face over in my mind, the way it had drained of color, the way she'd said, "You don't know, do you?" Like she already knew the answer and hated having to be the one who said it out loud. The next morning, while David was in the shower, I did something I'd never once done in 16 years of marriage. I opened his laptop. "I want to be honest with you." I told myself I was checking nothing in particular, some vague notion of paying a bill, and that if I happened to see something, that wasn't snooping. That was simply being present in my own home. His email was already logged in the way it always was because David had never once considered that I might look. What I found in the first 3 minutes undid every careful assumption I'd built my adult life around. There was a folder labeled, without any apparent shame, M Street. Inside it, receipts. A lease agreement, signed 8 months earlier for a 2-bedroom apartment on Maple Street across town. A pediatrician's invoice for a well-child visit. A boy, 22 months old, last name Reyes. And beneath all of it, a string of wire transfers, monthly, going back nearly 2 years, each one routed from the Carter and Boyd business account through a vendor line item labeled equipment maintenance, landing every single time in an account under the name Camilla Reyes. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, staring at numbers on a screen, waiting to feel the thing you're supposed to feel. Betrayal, rage, grief. Instead, what I felt first, strange as it sounds, was almost relief. The specific relief of finally understanding a shape you'd only been feeling the edges of in the dark for years. David came downstairs already dressed, already checking his watch, already halfway into the day's performance of being a busy, important man. "You're up early," he said, not really looking at me. "Something wrong?" "No," I said, and closed the laptop gently, the way you close a door on a room you're not ready to walk back into yet. "Just tired." He kissed the top of my head on his way to the coffee pot, the same absent, habitual kiss he'd given me 1,000 mornings before, and I understood in that moment that he had no idea the ground beneath his feet had already shifted. I didn't confront him. I want to be clear about why, because I think people expect the confrontation to come immediately. The shouting, the thrown plate, the dramatic exit. That's not what happened. What I did instead, over the following 2 weeks, was quietly become the most attentive bookkeeper Carter and Boyd Construction had ever had. I had built the financial systems for that company myself in its early years, back when David still needed me for something other than looking presentable at client dinners. I still had access technically, even if David had long since stopped thinking of me as anything but decorative. I pulled every wire transfer routed under equipment maintenance for the last 23 months. I cross-referenced them against actual equipment purchases, against actual maintenance logs, against actual invoices from actual vendors. The gap between what had been logged and what had actually happened was not small. It was $140,000, sent quietly month after month to fund an apartment, a child, and an entire second life David had built 40 minutes across town while telling me at every dinner that we needed to tighten our belts. The twist wasn't the affair. I understood that clearly by the end of the first week, once the shock had settled into something colder and more useful. This was not a man who had fallen in love with someone else. This was a man methodically siphoning money out of a business he co-owned, dressing it up as maintenance costs, building himself an exit, and preparing, I would learn, to declare the company insolvent within the year, walk away clean under the cover of bankruptcy, and leave me holding debts against a house and a business that on paper I still technically co-owned. I found the second half of the plan almost by accident, in an email thread between David and his business partner, Marcus Boyd, dated only 3 weeks earlier. Marcus, to his credit, sounded uneasy in his replies, asking twice for clarification on projected losses that didn't match David's own numbers from the year before. David's responses were smooth, reassuring, the same tone he used on me at dinner parties. "Trust me on this one," he'd written. "Sometimes you have to let something die to build something better." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Sometimes you have to let something die to build something better. He meant the company. He meant, I understood slowly, me as well. I want to tell you about the moment that changed from information into resolve, because it wasn't the money, and it wasn't even the apartment on Maple Street. It was a photograph I found buried 3 folders deep, a birthday photo, the boy turning 2, sitting in a high chair with frosting on his face, and David crouched beside him, laughing, wearing an expression of open, uncomplicated joy I had not seen on his face in years. Not once. Not even on our wedding day. That boy had David's exact eyes. The same pale gray-green, the same slight downward tilt at the outer corner. 10 years earlier, I had asked David, gently, hopefully, if we might try for a child of our own. "I'm not ready, Helen," he'd said. "Maybe when things settle down at work." Things at Carter and Boyd had never once settled down enough in 10 years for me. They had settled down plenty, apparently, for Camilla Reyes. I printed that photograph. I don't fully know why, except that I needed something physical to hold on to while I decided what came next. Something heavier than a spreadsheet. I made 2 calls after that. The first was to my cousin Renata, a forensic accountant I hadn't spoken to properly in almost a year. The kind of relative you love but drift from when your husband quietly discourages every friendship that doesn't serve his image. She listened to 15 minutes of numbers without interrupting once, and at the end of it she said only, "Helen, this isn't a divorce case. This is a federal case. You need to talk to someone who handles financial fraud, not just custody and property." She gave me a name. A woman named Priya Anand, a white-collar investigator who'd worked with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division before going independent. The second call was harder. I called Marcus Boyd directly, David's business partner of 11 years, a man who had eaten dinner at my table more times than I could count, and I told him I needed to see him privately without David about the company's books. He agreed without asking why, and I think some part of him, hearing the tone in my voice, already suspected the shape of what was coming. The 3 weeks between that dental office waiting room and the meeting I eventually arranged were the strangest of my life, because I had to keep living inside a marriage I already understood was over, sitting across from David at dinner while he complained about a subcontractor's delays, nodding while he told me again that money was tight this quarter, that we might need to hold off on the kitchen renovation I'd been wanting for years. I watched him lie to my face with the same ease he'd always had, and for the first time in 16 years, I didn't feel small while he did it. I felt like I was watching a performance I already knew the ending to. One of those nights stays with me more than the others. It was a Sunday, and David had made a rare effort, opened a bottle of wine, put on the kind of playlist he only used when he wanted something from me, though I no longer remembered what that might be. Halfway through dinner, he reached over and covered my hand with his, an old familiar gesture, and said, almost fondly, "You know, Helen, 16 years, and you still can't run a checkbook without me looking over your shoulder. Where would you even be without me?" He laughed when he said it, light, easy, the way you laugh at something you consider obviously true. I laughed too, quietly, and refilled his glass, and underneath the table my other hand was resting on my phone, on a folder of screenshots I had spent that afternoon organizing into chronological order. I remember thinking with something almost like pity that he had no idea he was asking a question I had already spent 3 weeks answering. I smiled at him across that table and said, I supposed he was right, and some part of me understood, clearly, for the first time, that the woman saying those words was not the same woman who had said them a month earlier, only wearing her face. There was a second memory that surfaced that same week, uninvited, the way old memories do when you finally stop being too busy to feel them. I thought about the nursery we never built, the room at the end of the hall that had become instead David's home office, filled with his framed industry awards and a leather chair he'd bought for $800 and never once let me sit in. I thought about standing in that doorway at 34 years old, asking him gently if we might try, and the flat, final way he'd said not yet, and how I had spent a decade believing him, believing there would eventually be a right time, never once suspecting that the right time had already come and gone for someone else entirely. I met with Priya Anand twice. She confirmed everything Renata had suspected and found more besides. A pattern of falsified maintenance invoices going back nearly 2 years, structured carefully enough to survive a casual audit, but not a determined one. She explained gently that what David had built met the threshold for wire fraud, and that once formal documentation was filed, federal investigators would likely be involved given the interstate nature of 2 of the vendor accounts he'd used to launder the transfers. You understand, she said to me near the end of our second meeting. Once this moves forward, it moves forward. There's no quiet version of this anymore. I told her I understood completely. I had spent 16 years choosing the quiet version of everything, and it had cost me a decade of a life I could have had a family in, had he simply been honest with me instead of somewhere else building one. I almost lost everything 2 days before that second meeting, in a way that still makes my chest tighten to think about. I had printed a fresh set of the transfer records at the kitchen table late one night, spreading them out to double-check a discrepancy Priya had flagged, and I fell asleep on the couch afterward without putting them away. I woke at 6 to the sound of David's alarm, and by the time I made it downstairs, he was already standing at the kitchen table, one of the printed pages in his hand, frowning slightly at a column of numbers he clearly didn't recognize. "What's this?" he said. Not alarmed yet, just curious in the mildly irritated way he got about anything he hadn't approved first. "Looks like the Boyd account. Why do you have this?" My heart was moving so fast I was certain he could hear it across the room. "Marcus asked me to help him reconcile something for the year-end audit," I said, keeping my voice as flat and bored as I could manage, reaching over and gathering the pages from his hand with the same unremarkable efficiency I used for gathering junk mail. "You know how he gets before tax season. I told him I'd take a look since I used to build these spreadsheets anyway. Oh, he shrugged, already losing interest, already reaching for his coffee instead. Tell him to hire an actual accountant, he said, and walked out to start his car. And I stood there in the kitchen with the pages pressed against my chest, understanding for the first time just how thin the wall was between the life I was quietly building evidence against and the life still hanging, undisturbed on the other side of it. I didn't leave those pages on the table again. From that morning on, everything went into a locked drawer at Renata's house instead, and I didn't sleep properly again until the day the folder finally left my hands for good. The meeting I arranged took place on a Thursday morning in the Carter and Boyd conference room, the same room where David had once proudly hung a framed photo of the two of us from the company's 5-year anniversary party. I told him only that Marcus wanted to review some year-end figures before a client presentation, nothing that would put him on guard. Marcus, for his part, had agreed to let the meeting play out exactly as Priya and I had planned it, once I'd shown him enough of the evidence himself the week before, watching his face go through the same slow collapse mine had. David arrived exactly on time, the way he always did, in the gray suit he wore for anything he considered important, already talking before he'd fully sat down, something about a subcontractor bid. He didn't notice Renata sitting quietly in the corner with a folder in her lap. He didn't notice Priya Anand seated near the door until she introduced herself, calmly by her full title. And I watched something behind his eyes flicker for the first time in years, not concern exactly, not yet. More like a man hearing a sound in his house he couldn't quite place. "What is this?" he said, and his voice had already lost some of its usual polish. Marcus was the one who spoke first, and I will always be grateful to him for that because I don't think I could have. "David," he said, sliding a folder across the table. The transaction records inside it fanned out just enough to be unmistakable. "I need you to explain the equipment maintenance line items from the last 23 months. Because Helen and I have gone through every invoice, and the numbers don't match anything that's actually happened at any of our job sites." I watched my husband's face rearrange itself in real time. Watch 16 years of careful, practiced confidence try and fail to find its footing. "There's context here," he started. "Vendor discrepancies happen all the time. I can walk you through." "You can walk us through the apartment on Maple Street too, then," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I had spoken to him in years. "And the pediatrician's bill for a boy who turned 2 last month. And the wire transfers to Camila Reyes that started almost exactly when you told me things were too tight for us to try for a child of our own." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had heard in that building in 11 years of visiting it. David looked at Marcus, searching, I think, for an ally who wasn't going to be there anymore. Marcus only shook his head slowly. The expression of a man mourning a friendship he now understood had never been what he'd thought it was. "Helen," David said, and his voice had dropped into something quieter, something almost pleading, the tone I imagine he used on people right before he needed something from them. "We can figure this out privately. This doesn't need to go any further than this room." "It already has," Priya said calmly, sliding her own folder across the table now, official letterhead visible at the top. "Mr. Carter, I've been retained to conduct a formal financial review of Carter and Boyd Construction on behalf of a business partner and shareholder. Based on the pattern of transfers we've documented, this matter has already been referred for further investigation at the federal level, given the interstate nature of 2 of the receiving accounts." I watched every ounce of color drain from my husband's face, and for one strange, unwanted second, some old, worn-down part of me almost felt sorry for him. That part didn't last long. "You did this," he said, turning to me, and there it was. Finally, the flicker of the old cruelty rising back up under pressure. The same tone he'd used the week I'd mentioned my accounting certification. "You went digging through my private business, and now you're going to destroy everything I've built. For what? Some petty revenge? You built a second family on money you stole from a company I helped you start," I said, and I felt something in my chest that had been tightening for 16 years finally, quietly, come loose. "I didn't destroy anything, David. I just stopped helping you hide it." There was a knock at the conference room door precisely then, timed by Priya in advance with a contact at the local field office who had been reviewing her preliminary findings for 2 days already. Two federal investigators stepped into the room, unhurried, procedural, asking David if he'd be willing to answer some questions about Carter and Boyd's financial records. He looked at me one last time before he stood, something desperate and searching in his face, like he still believed there was a version of this where I softened, where 16 years of habit made me quietly fix this the way I had quietly fixed everything else for him. I didn't soften. I sat very still, the printed photograph of a 2-year-old boy with his father's eyes folded inside my bag beside me, and I watched my husband walk out of that conference room between two federal agents while the employees in the hallway outside, people who had watched him talk down to me at company parties for a decade, went very quiet. I want to tell you the rest doesn't matter as much as that moment did, but that wouldn't be honest either. The investigation took the better part of a year to fully resolve. David was charged with wire fraud and eventually reached a plea agreement that included restitution and a suspended sentence, a fate his lawyer called fortunate, and I called exactly proportional to a man who had never once faced real consequences for anything in his life until that morning. Marcus bought out David's remaining share of the company at a fraction of its former value, and, in a gesture I hadn't expected, offered me a position managing the company's books officially, on paper, with a salary and a title, the job David had told me for a decade I wasn't corporate material enough to hold. Camila Reyes, when Priya eventually reached out to her as part of the investigation, turned out to be exactly what I suspected by then. Not a villain in this story, but another woman David had lied to just as thoroughly. Told he was already divorced, told the construction money was simply his own generous salary. She and I have spoken exactly twice, both times briefly, both times without anger between us. Two women comparing notes on the same careful liar. The first time we spoke was on the phone, 3 weeks after the conference room, both of us still raw in different directions. She was quiet for a long time before she said anything at all. He told me your divorce was already final, she said finally, her voice unsteady. Back when I was pregnant. He showed me papers. I found out 2 months ago they were fake, printed off some template, notarized by a stamp he bought online. I've been packing boxes ever since, trying to figure out how to explain any of this to a 2-year-old someday. I told her I believed her because I did, because I recognized in her voice the exact same particular shame of having trusted the wrong version of a man who was very, very good at building versions of himself for whoever was standing in front of him. Neither of us apologized to the other because neither of us had anything to apologize for. We simply sat on that call for a while, two women who had separately built parts of their lives on the same lie, and let the silence be honest instead of angry. Her son will grow up, I imagine, never fully understanding why his father's name doesn't appear on much of anything important. That isn't my story to finish telling. As for me, I finalized the divorce 8 months after that Thursday morning, and I kept the house, kept my seniority at the company, kept, more than anything, the sense of myself I'd nearly forgotten how to hold on to after 16 years of being told I was nothing without him. I finished the accounting certification David once told me we couldn't afford. It took me 4 months of night classes, and I framed the certificate and hung it in my new office at Carter and Boyd, the same office where David used to sit with his door closed, deciding quietly how small I was allowed to be. I still have that photograph, the boy with the frosting on his face and his father's eyes. I don't know exactly why I kept it. Maybe because it was the first piece of proof I ever held that told me the whole truth at once, instead of the careful, edited version I'd been handed for 16 years. Maybe because some part of me needed to remember that the version of my life I'd been living wasn't the only one being lived on that money, and that the ending, however it came, was never really about revenge. It was about finally being allowed to know the truth about my own life. If this story moved you even a little, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, so leave it in the comments below. And if you believe every quiet woman deserves the chance to finally see the whole picture, hit subscribe, because there are so many more stories like Helen's waiting to be told, and I don't want you to miss a single one.